If you're ready to make changes in your life, then stay a while and let deep conversation unlock the place you're most ready to transform. Welcome to Breathtakingly Imperfect, a podcast dedicated to exploring the human experience and sharing of heart-earned wisdom to help you live with love, presence, and freedom. I offer insights from my own journey of healing, peace, and personal growth in hopes of inspiring you to find meaning, fulfillment, and a true love for life. I'm your host, Yesenia. Let's walk this breathtakingly and imperfectly beautiful journey I call life. The purpose for today's episode is to share the way inner self-discovery removes the external roles we've taken on, as well as the validation we associate to our self-worth. I'd also like to share how inner work can help cultivate an awareness through making and breaking connections within ourselves so we can begin to recognize and honor who we already are. Being curious about my purpose in this life first started with wanting to know who I really was. Whenever I introduced myself to people, I'd say that I was a stay-at-home mom. But the moment that those words left my lips, my mind would space, and I'd wonder if that was all I was. Before I was a stay-at-home parent, I was a working parent, but was that also all that I was? Those were the kind of questions that made me begin my search for the person I was underneath all of the titles. It was while reading A New Earth by Eckhart Tolle, where the concept of who I was and what I thought I was this whole time really blew my mind. Like, you can insert an exploding head emoji right here. He says, close your eyes for a moment and find out if there is life inside your hands. I loved that line because on the journey of finding yourself, there is nothing more intimate than remembering that life starts with us. And just like with self-love, I thought that self-discovery was somewhere outside of me waiting to be found, when really I realized it began with the very breath I took and every beat my heart got to live each and every day. I'd only ever felt this level of appreciation for life, for example, like when it came to my kids. But what I learned was that I didn't have that same level of appreciation for my own life. My connection to life was attached to the perception of others. I'd take those in like a report card, and I'd let them determine whether I was excelling in life or failing. It was the words, how you are seen by others becomes the mirror that tells you what you are like and who you are. That just like really sat with me. It even stung a little. I'd only ever sought to see myself if I was being seen as like a super mom or a super student or like the best employee. So in other words, if I was seen as valuable in their eyes, for me, that meant I was valuable. I just hadn't made the connection. It had always been in my character to be a striver, but it was that sentence that brought clarity to the reason why I was doing it. My sense of worth was obtained from others rather than from myself. This perception challenged me to find the ways in which I viewed myself. So Eckhart Tolle says that you can find out how you're viewing yourself by referring to anything that you view as I, me, I or mine. So for me, my I was I am an independent woman. My was my responsibilities. And my mine was my kids. Those they were mine. And the me here for me was anything I believed was a distinction of who I was, like my woes, as I'd like to call them, like being a child of divorce or the daughter to a single parent. So, like things like that. Bringing those out to the forefront helped shatter the limiting beliefs I built about myself. And I say limiting because I am more than what I identified as. These were true to an extent of my life, but I'd only ever held those titles to define who I was. And I was more. The identity of a mother, a wife, a sister, a niece, a cousin, a friend, they're all completely factual to my life. But back then, they'd also just been roles I felt like I was playing and not experiencing. The more I searched for myself, the more I realized I was buried pretty deep down the identities I had wrapped my sense of self around. I was a wife and I played a wife role. I was so many other things and lived each the way those identities are expected to because I just assumed that's what you did. As a teenage parent, I literally was told, well, you're a mom now. And because I was instantly in love with my son, I took the identity they told me I was and I completely engulfed myself within it. I know that particular subject can be a messy slope given the nature of my situation, but what I'm trying to explain is that while I did become a parent, I was also a kid that put away everything she was to assume just one identity. It's for this very reason I think it's worth exploring the roles we take on and play to the T, because in doing so, we can begin to bring to the surface who we are before those identities. Being a teen parent has its stigmatized characteristics. I knew it even back then. And had I assumed the identity of such, my story would have been lived differently. The realization here being the power the things we let identify us has over how we get to live life and the treasure it truly is to begin to find ourselves once again. For me, it felt like extending a hand down to the part of me that had been stuck deep down in a well underneath layers and layers of services to finally being pulled out to take some air. I felt a curiosity for myself that no longer felt like longing, and it began to feel more like exploring. Yes, I was so many things for so many people, but who was I for myself? That exploration has been the very best part of my journey so far. Exploring the identities I'd compiled on over the course of my life felt like sorting through piles and piles of laundry. As with any closet clean out, you'll start to ask yourself, why do I still have this? That's what it was like as I tried to understand why I had held on to certain identities for so long. So I created a sorting process of sorts. I took each identity I had claimed and reflected on whether I was holding on to it out of attachment or because I believed it gave me some sort of value and self worth. All of this took time, patience, and a lot of honesty. It required me to accept what I had piled on and why I had piled it on in the first place. And that part was probably the most challenging because I'd collected and piled on identities that I ultimately saw that weren't ever 100% me. I felt like an imposter in my own life. That realization as frustrating as it had been only meant I got to begin the journey of removing what I'd misidentified with and got closer to who I was underneath it all. It was a journey I wanted to take, no matter what presented itself. Eckhart Tolle, in his book A New Earth, says attachment to things drops away by itself when you no longer seek to find yourself in them. So reflecting on this was very eye-opening to me because it had been the only way I had ever known of viewing myself. If you really think about it, it's crazy. We don't look inward to see ourselves. We look out to things and people to tell us who we are. You can understand now why my next steps included making a very long list of identities that took up the biggest roles in my life, finding what attachments I saw in each of them, and most important of all, recognizing that each trait I saw in each of them was something I already had. For example, as an employee, I always sought the identity of a leader. So I was always in search of the next promotion because I could only be viewed as a leader if I was in a leadership position. Recognizing that leadership identity was realizing I did not need to be in a leadership role to be a leader. Reflecting back on my life, I recognize I had always been a natural leader and that did not need to be attached to a title in order to be true. As a mom, the identity I longed for was of a loving mother, just like the best mom. The search for that validation came in overextending myself to the point of exhaustion, just because I wanted to feel like my kids felt that they were loved and had a great mother. Even that statement there is so unreasonable to me now because there would be no way for me to actually feel what they feel. So I recognized that I already had the love that is shared between my kids and I. I was already a loving mother because the love there completely existed. I already was the best parent I could possibly be because that had always been my intention. These identities are a part of me, and searching within myself to recognize the qualities I already had is what began to separate the attachments from my true identities. And detaching just meant being able to live out each trait as something I already was and not something I needed to prove. It meant I wasn't all one thing or the other. They were just parts of me I get to experience knowing I was already worthy of them. It's owning, acknowledging, and honoring who you are without attaching it to anything else in order for it to be true. In Eckhart's words, you do not become good by trying to be good, but by finding the goodness that is already within you and going forward with the sense of I am, but from a much deeper place within yourself. That's breaking attachment and building connections right back to yourself. I learned the ways in which I already was so many of the things I searched endlessly for. I'd go from what felt like an endless chase to the freedom of living each part of my life like it was a prize and I had already won the trophy. So, how do you tell the difference between what is authentically you from the attachment to an identity? Eckhart writes, sometimes you may not know what you are attached to, something which is to say, identified until you lose it. Or there is the threat of loss. If you then become upset, anxious, and so on, it means you are attached. I saw this in the way I thought about who I'd be once my kids ventured off in life. As determined as I was to find myself, the perception of not being left with much as my kids began to find more independence was the indicator that I was obviously attached. I mean, truthfully, who isn't attached to their kids? I'd come to learn how to detach, still being me, and love them in a way that was not ever lost, threatened, or anxious. The way I began to open what the attachments could be in each identity was to literally write out my laundry list of identities. I started with writing down the roles I played, like mother, daughter, sister, wife, neighbor, niece, and so on. Then I wrote down any negative thoughts, actions, or emotions I had with others. Pride almost got in the way of this next part here because even in the privacy of my own space, I found it was an inner battle to find acceptance for the things I felt were lacking. It was like fighting through the very defenses we built to protect us. But after managing to be able to put my guard down, I took the reasons for my attachments and any other grievances I'd had and pulled out only the parts of me that were trying to come across. For example, when we bought our first home, we had an oversized and under pruned rose bush in the front of our house. It was so unruly that it looked more like a tree and not much like anything remotely rose related. It obviously had been there for quite some time because the branches were tough and that made it harder to tame. But little by little, I'd choose a spot on the bush and started to prune and began removing whatever was dead, branches that like twisted and went nowhere, and just took care of its unruliness the best way that I could. Let me tell you, when I was done pruning, that bush looked even crazier than it had before. I had almost regretted that I had even started it. It just looked like a hot mess. But to my surprise, over time, that tree began to truly flourish. It looked so beautiful when it was in bloom, and it just began to do what it needed to throughout the year. In a way, I believe we are all unruly, beautiful rose bushes. Sure, the thorns make it harder to get to prune the branches that need to go, aka our attachments. But even if you get nicked trying to get to what's there, preventing your growth, it's always worth it because then you get the space for something new to bloom. I discovered that even though being 100% truthful with myself about the reason behind my attachments and grievances was not simple, it was a humbling experience because you get to recognize something within yourself you'd failed to acknowledge before. I was actually in the process of working on identifying my attachments when I brought my attention to the way my inner voice would criticize this beautiful home I drive by every single day. It was something extremely judgy and made no sense. Like, oh, look at the bench the neighbor picked out. Like, sure, it's nice, but like, is it even comfy? And maybe after driving, I don't know, like 7 more times by the house, I acknowledged my own judgment. And then I put it on the list of negative thoughts, emotions, and things I wanted to explore. What I figured out was that I wasn't so much judging the home as I was the person inside of the home. This person had a career that was once my dream, and I'd had to put down as I realized that I was becoming a mother. Damn, right? I think I brought this up to my sister in conversation, and it was actually her that took what I'd seen as a missed career opportunity and helped me to see the root behind the career path I didn't get to experience. It was expression through creativity. She helped me realize the ways in which I'd always carried creativity in everything that I did, from the way our home was to the things I did for my kids and even just stuff like setting up their birthday parties. I was really taken back by that because she was right. I may not have had that career path, but the reason I even wanted to take that route was because of my love of creating. And that part had never gone away. it was me. Needless to say, when I happen to drive by this house, which is every single day, I don't stare it down anymore like I used to. I actually went by several times after, and I noticed that I would smile as I drove by it. And to the point where, truthfully, I just even forgot that it's there. It's just another house. It had been difficult to bring my attention to something I felt I'd failed to start. Metaphorically speaking, it was a thick and prickly branch going nowhere that needed to go. So I took my shears and I removed what would eventually leave space for another part to grow. I'm still a rose bush, even as I pluck away at my parts. This is how I viewed being able to separate the attachments from what made me, me. I'm investigative by nature. If something catches my interest, especially if I don't know much about it, I seek to try and understand it. I mean, it was my curiosity alone that began unfolding this very journey. And the most important lesson I've gained is that the work belongs to you. The will belongs to you. The action and inaction all belong to you. The will to find who I was in this world came from the inner work I continuously did. So, what is inner work? For me, it is journeying deeply within to understand personal triggers, heal emotional wounds, and understand myself more in the process. It's work done with intention that connected me to my purpose and peeled back the layers from the life it felt like I hadn't chosen to one I chose to live. And that's the thing with inner work. It's work done with awareness, choice, and action. The most beautiful part of inner work is that, in my experience, has always brought forth the changes I needed to take me to the next part of my life. When I first started my journey, I didn't know that what I was doing was inner work. There was an awareness of an issue with my father, which lived in my head for months before I made the choice to explore it, which also took its own time to cook. But eventually, I arrived at the point of action. I was able to really see the triggers I'd unconsciously developed as a result of my dad. Healed a part that was wrapped in fear, grief, and anger, understood who I was as a person because of it, connected me to the courage I gained in the way that it's a part of my purpose, and reminded me that I wasn't a victim of that life's experience, and instead reminded me of everything that I had gained. Inner work offered me the ability to have a point of view that pulls apart the emotions that connected my past to the present in order to have more peace in my future. It's been the inner work that I've done that has left me at the doorstep of the therapists I've worked with and have journeyed alongside me, which have undoubtedly furthered my progress. But at the end of the day, action is what drives getting to a therapist in the first place and doesn't stop when the session does. The work we do within ourselves starts with us and it's driven by us. Maybe the journey isn't of finding yourself. Maybe you already have. Maybe it starts with the things in our lives that linger over us, the thoughts that seem to pop in from time to time. The moment the work has begun, so does the journey. The choice is ours. Curiosity opened the vacantness I'd felt about the roles I thought defined me. I began to discover that my identity was shaped by how I wanted to be perceived rather than by my own inner understanding of who I was. It was understanding the attachments and separating them from my life identities that helped me see which aspects were truly mine. It also supported my growth by realizing the ways I sought validation in qualities I already had. For me, inner work was a mode of progression. It gave me the space to reflect on triggers, healing emotional wounds, and choosing how to grow. The more I worked on understanding myself, the more I realized that that was the place real change started from. When I brainstorm through these episodes, sometimes I start with feeling a bit silly for wanting to talk about things like this very subject, the who am I? And before my self talk starts to get negative, I bring it back to having these conversations from the heart. Then I reflect on the reason why I'm doing this all. And it's for people that may be asking the same questions I did. I never asked who I was until about 6 years ago. I had asked who I was going to be growing up, but I've come to learn it's a much simpler process to understand who you are, to know who you can be. I remember the feeling of vastness and unattainability whenever I thought about finding who I was. Like the answer would be at the end of a finish line. As much as I wanted to find the answer, I felt alone and terrified I would not find what I was looking for. What I've discovered is that there is no finish line. We are the starting point and the whole journey. The only thing left for us to do is start. I like to view life as our very own gardens, meant to be nurtured, cleared, and just allowed to bloom. So, as you go on to explore your life's personal oasis, as always, may you leave here only with what can help yours grow. I am so grateful to have shared the space with you. And if this episode planted something within you, you can water it with me on Instagram, where this community continues to bloom. The link for that is in the show notes. Until next time, keep honoring your growth, trusting your path, and embracing this breathtakingly and perfectly beautiful journey that is life.